have a distinct pleasure today to be interviewing Stewart Ford. Our families go back together quite a number of years.
Yes.
Not necessarily on the farming front, which will be the primary focus of this interview, but in other ways and other hobbies. So today I'd like to introduce Stewart by asking Stewart if he'd tell us a bit about how his family came to Alberta, came to Penhold, and eventually to their own Stewart brothers ended up extending their businesses to Red Deer. So Stewart will go over some of those highlights, and perhaps Stewart, you begin by telling how your family got into the agricultural business and came to Alberta, or vice versa.
Well, they came out of Ontario. Things weren't working out for John Hay, who was the Stewart who came out, and they decided to take a fresh start out west. So they took the steamer through the Great Lakes and got off at the landing just in northern Ontario, and then took the rail, came into Calgary 1884, and then came north. They had taken a quarter section homestead.
That'd be 6 years before the railway came to Red Deer.
Yes, yeah, the railway wasn't until, 90?
90.
And they had all of their gear. Fortunately, they had a sister relative who had married John Stevens, and Stevens was in the business of manufacturing buggies and farm equipment and stuff. And the ideal then
in Alberta?
No, this is in Ontario.
Yeah.
So before they left, he gave them a wagon that had been brought up from the States so the Canadians would copy it and make their own. And I think they paid $20 for it. And a few other things that helped out. And he also helped out later when they were struggling on the farm. So they came west and came up from Calgary, got settled in on their little house. And then, of course, the rebellion happened, so everybody hiked it back to Calgary. And Norman sold newspapers there for a fellow, made a little bit of money.
And that'd be Norman Stewart.
Norman Stewart, who was the senior of the two. Norman was 9 and my grandfather was 3. And they spent their time in Calgary, then came back up to the homestead. Like a lot of homesteaders, they struggled, but they kept their head above water. The brothers, Norman and his friend Bill Douglas, formed a little partnership where they had a case steamer and a thrashing machine. And they did thrashing in the area. And that continued on till probably around the 1910 area when Norman had been married and Tom married. So they had to spend more time on their business. But my grandfather in 1900, took both barrels of a shotgun up one side. And it was from getting up in the buggy, bringing the shotgun up and just putting it down. And the one barrel went off. It was cap and ball. One barrel went off, fired the other one. And I happened to see him one time when my grandmother, I was staying at their house, said, go to the bedroom and tell Tom, breakfast is ready. So I went to the door and opened it, and my grandfather was startled, standing there as he was born. But he had a white scar that started just under his armpit and went right down to his shoulder, to his hip, and across about a quarter of the body. 6 months in the hospital, survived a disease, I think typhoid, and because Tom wasn't able to take heavy work, they decided to go into business. So $600 loan from Banker Manning, and they were on their way. And
that started
yeah,
Stewart Brothers?
yeah, they bought out one fellow, and then 3 other fellows came in and wanted to sell. So they took over the whole bunch of them. And what was happening was a lot of people had come out from the east, going to make their fortune in the west. Found out there weren't that many people out there, and every one of them was trying to make their fortune. But they'd have a little business, maybe a few sticks of lumber, a little bit of machinery of some sort, maybe some hardware. And they were wanting to get out. And get out they did. And either they just left or they found someone like Norman and Tom that would buy them out. But the real practical thing about Stewart Brothers was that my grandfather was a mechanic. He could fix a knotter on a binder like nobody's business, and handle anything else in the primitive machinery of the time, and then carry on as the machinery became more complicated. And Norman was the businessman and knew how to get sales coming in and talk to the banker and keep things going. And largely it was a promissory note business. And first of all, the machine companies carried a note. And eventually that changed to the dealer having to carry the note. But they got their start, and by 1914, in the records I have, I think the net worth of the business was around $14,000. Norman had married. Tom married in 10.
Stewart, just to highlight it, then this is
That's Norman.
Norman, and
Senior.
this is
And
Tom.
that's Tom.
That's Tom. Okay.
And my grandfather was named after the Stevens family, which was, of course, the sister's married name. And my mother always said that that was probably done to hope that they would get assistance from the Stevens. And they did. They did. The first baler they had, because they sold a lot of hay all through the interior of BC to the lumber yards, lumber mills, and they baled it with a half bale, which meant the horse went halfway around to form the power, and then would be turned and taken back. And it worked, but it was a strenuous operation, and these big bales, and they shipped them on the CP out wherever they had to go.
Wherever there was a need for hay. Can you take us through the history of Stewart Brothers then, fairly quickly? Some of the highlights and some of the challenges that they faced.
Well,
after World War One.
The biggest change came after the First War, because all of a sudden the farms were mechanizing. And my great uncle mentioned in his writings that everybody had to take horses in trade. So because of that, they bought farmland. And that was so they had a place to keep the horses. The first part of the farmland is what we know as a CPR farm, and we're sitting on the CPR farmland as we're talking. It's on the west side of the track in Penhold and goes into Fleming.
Just outside your window.
Right, the Fleming Slough. And the slough was an advantage because when you built your wood water troughs and stuff, you kept them in the slough to keep them swollen, so that when the fellow took it home, well, it still held water instead of leaking until it finally soaked itself. And then in the dry years, it was hayland. And it worked. Everything sort of tied together. But anyway, in taking their tractors and taking horses on tractors and selling the machinery, binders and thrashing machines, whatever was needed, the horses then would be sold off. And I know that one carload ended up in Quebec, lumber bills in Quebec. So they certainly were broader in their thinking. They weren't just simply sitting in the little parish. They were in the diocese and even got out into the Papal See with some of the stuff they were doing.
They were taking payments in kind.
Yeah. But anyway, the real growth of the business through the 20s, provided the funds that took them through the 30s and also allowed them to expand the business. And that took place starting in 1934, 35, 36.
You said that in the process they got through almost unblemished through the mini depression we had here in the early 20s.
Yeah.
And then they by the 30s they were actually quite had a very good financial foundation.
Yes, very much so. They had shares in various companies that they could use to buy land with eventually. So in the 30s they bought Section 26, which is right next to this property. They also bought Section 26 and 35, which is next to 36, which is the town of Penhold, that's the west side and occupies part of the Fleming Slough.
So your family owned a good portion of what is now Penhold.
Oh yes, they owned 4 cream stations. There was 2 fires in Penhold. The first one was in, I think, 1921 or 20, and the second one was about 2 or 3 years later. And the later one was certainly arson. My grandfather told me the story. He worked with me when I started, and we were redoing all the lumber bits to get the lumber organized because I was on that side of the business. And he said that where we were working, that used to be a certain business. And when the fire was noted and called, he ran down and went in through the front door, and on the counter, all the books were laid out. So that's very suspicious that the books are on the counter. They're usually in the safe, so they're preserved. And so he just took the counter and flipped it, and the books were burned. I know the other side of the story, whose it was. But anyway, that cleaned out a whole bunch of stuff, and at the same time, 4 cream stations.
Were they insured, or did they lose a fair bit of money in the process?
Yeah, but 4 cream stations that the company owned were burnt, and they owned the cream stations, but there was 4 different people that they rented them out to collect the cream from the farmers that came in, and of course that got made into butter and all this sort of stuff. But the end result was that when they did the final expansion, they did a barn, the fencing, the well, first deep water well in Penhold, the farmhouse for the farm manager, some outbuildings, and then they took an opportunity to go into Red Deer and build the machine dealership. And it was designed with a basement that was the machine shop and had a big lift elevator to take the machinery up and down. And the upper was the offices, parts department, and display floor. And that building is the one that shows up quite frequently in articles because it was the 1941 bond drive office for the war bonds. Anyway, they had that built. 5 years previously, they had gone in and were in the old stables.
Is this in Red Deer?
Yes. And Jack Stewart, Norman's eldest son, operated that. He was the first of that next generation to come into the business. And that was progressively working out. So then they did the big building. And right after that, they also took over a building supply, lumberyard. So they were able to take lumber in trade because they could sell the lumber, get the money to buy the machinery, to sell the machinery. And the real benefit came in the Second War when all of a sudden production went over to war production. Very few tractors being produced, very few trucks, very few threshing machines, whatever. But they had the ability to repair them and because of the machine shop. So they were able to, again, take lumber in from the West Country, which is where the mills were, and we're talking out as far as Rocky Mountain House, convert that into cash for building and stuff. And during the war, business was declared a vital industry. A big shop was built in Penhold for mainly building grain bins and stuff, because there was no storage facilities for all this grain that wasn't being shipped. And that's when all the elevators got annexes, and the grain bin business from the shop. We were able to get a K5 International truck that was painted in the war colors, the army colors, khaki. When my father took it out to Rocky Mountain House to pick up a load of lumber, he had a crowd around it, and an offer of $4,000 for the truck that actually cost the business $1,400.
So we sold
it wasn't sold. And then the building supply also in Penhold, we got a DeWalt radial arm saw, 16-inch, and I used it all my time out in the shop. And it was got from the States, and it took a permit from Washington and a permit from Ottawa to have that saw brought in. That's how tight stuff was.
during the war.
Yeah, but they did well, and of course, by then, my mother had married Graham Ford, who came into the business. They were both teachers, and the practice was Graham would come in from Castor, where he was teaching, during the summer, and work at the business, and then go back to his school, Beaverdale, and teach. Well, of course, he came over. I was born in 1938, and in October, so June of 39, my father came over to work in the business. It was obvious there was going to be a war, and of course the war happened in September, and he never went back. So that brought Graham into the business. Young Norman, Norman's senior's son, was in the business by then. But then during the war, young Norman was serving in BC. Jack was serving in Ontario in London, England, in the army, and 10 other members of staff were in the services. And the remarkable thing is, they all came back. No one got killed.
These 10 staff were in Penhold?
And Red Deer.
And Red Deer. Yeah.
But they were big families that had lots of children, so you supported the war effort. But the farm hired Phil Tweeton as the farm manager, and Phil had a large family. 3 sons were in the services, but they had all worked for the business. Anyway, the war got over. Everybody came home, and in 1946, I remember I went out during the harvest. I was in one of the hay wagons, which they were putting the sheaves of wheat on to take to the thrashing machine, and that was the last thrashing we did. But there was all this manpower around because nobody had got off to their job, so it worked out very well. So I got to take part in the last harvest using a thrashing machine. After that, it was all combines, and then the Red Deer operation grew. The lumberyard was expanded. Of course, there was all the housing going on
after the war.
Or
during the war too.
And business to be done. So that proved very profitable. I know when I look at the returns from those years, it was extremely profitable time. And at the same time, the girls, two of Norman's daughters, had been put into the business. They were just out of school. Kay was the parts girl, and Gwen sort of ran the office, and their dad, Norman, would go in, drive in, and just do a check on things.
In Red Deer.
And in the 60s, when I was became very active in the business, I would have customers ask about that girl in the parts department who sure knew the parts numbers. And Gwen was very good in the sales of what they did have to sell. So the girls were in the business then, and that mirrored what was happening back in the beginning of the business. Allie, one of the daughters who later became a nurse, would go down and open the store because Tom and Norman would be doing something on the farm. And then once the business got going, three of the sisters were involved in the business. And their salaries were put into the business. They would probably have a drawing account to have some spending money. But in 1910, when they left the business, every one of them had about $800 to $900 available to them, and that paid for their educations, got them set up. 25-cent meals, $800 isn't getting hurt right now.
And what was the year?
It would be 1910. And the girls, Allie was a nurse down in Winnipeg. Mabel was in hospital work, and then the other two were teachers. So
Were these
the women
sisters then of Norman and Tom?
They were sisters of Norman and Tom.
Yeah.
So the women were very important then, and then later on in Red Deer there was a lady there in the lumberyard who knew what she was doing, and the lumberyard in Red Deer was run by the Thorns, and Mrs. Thorne and Ollie were quite a partnership. But they were masterful in that. They were well recognized in the community, and they know how to run a lumberyard. And they retired after the war, and then Jack was in Red Deer doing things, and eventually Jack wanted to not retire but cut back, so he came to Pennell to run the farm, and with his son. Eldest son, Mike. This would be in the late 60s and then up into the 70s. So everybody sort of found their way. The girls married and started their families, Calgary and on a farm here as well. And by then I was in the business in the 60s. Actually, I started in 1958. And by the 60s, we had separated the lumber business from the machinery business as far as where you went to order stuff. We had our own store by then. The Red Deer yard had been leased to Monarch Lumber, so we no longer were in Red Deer in building supply. And with Jack retiring, the Red Deer machine business was leased. I think Hudson Bay went in first, and then Sears, and eventually the Ranch House restaurant in the building. The original lumberyard burnt out, but was rebuilt, and it's still there. Yeah. So
the machinery building is still there.
Yeah. So what happened was we moved out of Red Deer by the 70s, and we were in Penhold as a building supply. My father cut back in 67. We gave International Harvester their notice, a year's notice. So by 68, we were simply a building supply. My dad had a few little odd end businesses that kept him busy in an office in the building. So it
certainly began,
it all worked all right. And then progressively, we bought out the other partners on the Norman Stewart side because Norman Jr. was the first one who wanted to leave. And then the sisters, of course, they were in Calgary, one on a farm at Pennell, the other in Edmonton, and a third was also in Edmonton as a nurse. So they had no interest in the business, and it worked out well for them. They sold their shares, and by the late 70s, my parents and myself and wife were the business that was Stewart Supplies.
Residual business, yeah, that carried on.
The partnership had to change into a business because they found out to their shock that if in the partnership, if anyone died, and by then the partners were in their late 60s or 70s, the government stepped in and said, okay, we're first, and then you get what's left. So if you have a shareholding business, it works a little differently. You're assessed by yourself, and the business can keep on going. So anyway, it worked out right.
The partnership is the hardest ship to steer.
Yeah, but the remarkable thing was that, and Gwen made the point on this, that was Norman Sr.'s, one of his daughters. The two partners lived side by side in their houses. And there was never, over the 50 years of their living together in those houses, an argument, an upset. Everybody got along. Norman with his big family, and Tom and Laura with their daughter. And that was a remarkable thing for a partnership, because that's the risk in them, that somebody figures that they're getting shortchanged. But it went along. And then we get into the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Well, my father had pretty well retired by the 80s. He was I was the largest partner, but my parents were the two largest partners together. So he kept an eye on things and was very welcome. Particularly in the 80s, there was a little bit of a kerfuffle with the banks and stuff, but everything went along nicely. And my parents died in the 90s, and the last thing my father said to me was, well, take the money and have fun. And I wasn't quite ready to, and then I wanted to see it to its 100th anniversary, because that's sort of one of those benchmark things. So we did, and gave the fellows their notice and said, 6 months from now, either there's going to be a building supply here, and you probably will have a job in there if you want it, or we're going to have a heck of an auction sale. As it turned out, we have a building supply in Hardware, and still do, in Penhold with Ed. So it was a very wonderful journey. And what I personally, looking back, realize and enjoy the fact that I was able to work with the founders. My grandfather helped me with the building of the first lumber bunks when we did the rechange in lumber. I used to hang out with him when he would be working on a binder or machine back in the 50s when I was a little kid. Norman was in the store. I think he was frustrated with my math sometimes, but that's okay. But they were there, and you sort of learned from them. And then after that, well, it was my parents, my father particularly, and eventually we're on our own, Marlene and myself. Yeah. But it was a wonderful life through that era, even though I wasn't in the era that it started. But I had a lot of first-hand knowledge of it because of those two very, very fine men. And just during my business life, in the 60s particularly, when the people I was dealing with were people who the business had helped to stay farming or helped get set up farming. They were in that retiring period, and as they retired, they all had to have a house off the farm. And we had some farm builders who did the work, so we were able to supply them. I did learn how to draw plans by virtue of my father spending $500 on a plan system that got us 10 plans and a book. I still have the book. And the first set of plans.
These are plans for building houses?
Yes, component housing. And we sold the first one, and it was a VLA job, Veterans Land Act. And so we had these plans with the architect's seal on them that we got with the book, and we fired them in. They didn't approve them. So we thought, well, they're sort of a bit unclear in the sense that they'd obviously been well used and the blueprinting was a little fuzzy. So in the old store we had these big windows, so we put the plans up on the big window, laid a piece of drafting paper over them and traced them off. Sent that in. That wouldn't work. So by now getting a little bit desperate, well, my father had a little drafting board about, 20 inches by about maybe 16, wood frame, linoleum base. So we took 1117 paper and stuck it on there and look at the plan and see what it said. And we had the T-square and the what is it, a 30-60 triangle, and a drafting pencil. So we would look at the plan and draw the line, and with the ruler mark the thing, draw the plans, sent them in, they were approved. Great, we're off. And the house is the furthest west house in Penhold on the north border of Penhold. And all of a sudden, there's this kid in Penhold that can draw plans. So fortunately, planning houses at that time, they were rectangles. You might have a letter L, but they were rectangles. And it was pretty simple to learn. And the carpenters, I would draw what I thought was right because of what was done before. And they'd come in and say, look, that's not how you do the stairs because the headroom's taken through the point of the tread on an angle like that, not from the flat of the tread. Well, okay. So people didn't hit their heads. And then hallways, no, you can't have 3 foot. You have to have on the framing a little wider because you got to remember that 2'8" door has a casing on it, and you got to have room for the casing on either side plus the drywall on the 2 walls in the hall. Oh, okay, we'll work the hallways different. And the rest of it was very straightforward. And we changed the system over of how it was done. And eventually we dropped it because I couldn't justify building the plans building the panels in the shop, and then taking them out to the job and having carpenters erect them when we could take the material to the job and we were supplying the trades at the time and just let them do it there. We could do pre-cutting, headers and floor joists, and eventually I found the trades, they said, don't cut the joists, we like to do it ourselves. Because they were having more trouble sorting through the pile for the digit number of the joist and where it was supposed to go. Particularly
this is an attempt at a prefab building that didn't work out.
But we got into truss rafters, first with plywood, then with a metal gusset that was a Bosch system where you shot a nail through, and they tended to be a little loose on the plates. And then eventually to the machine. In the 80s we had the truss shop. And that was a critical part of what you could supply and what you could do. And the system changed very dramatically in the late 60s, everybody had to have an arch rafter shed. Neighbor had one, you had to have one too. And usually you had to have a bigger one. And we sold them like mad and had crews going all over. And then that business just stopped. And it went to posts and truss rafters. And people would come in and say, well, what's the cheapest one to do? And I would just say, well, look what's being done. And as soon as the truss business got to the steel-plated truss that made it an engineered product and not as expensive, all of a sudden everything changed to be a straight wall building with a truss roof. Yeah. But you go through the progression of an industry and how it changes. And either you sort of change with it and take advantage of it or come up with a better idea. One of the things I got a little upset about was we were doing 412 roof buildings, overhangs, soffits, fascias, straight walls, and we were cladding them with metal. But if you looked at a metal building, they had a very low roof, no overhangs except for the metal, and the nice straight walls. So you got rid of all this clutter. So the problem was to get a truss that you could build that low of a pitch, because I wanted it at 1:12. And we got it, but what happened is the heels went out. And that was all right because you could run a layer of metal horizontally to take care of that, lap it over the vertical metal. So we came up with a building that was a wood building, but it looked like a steel building. And it was very popular, worked very well for us. And eventually, a few copies too. But it's just you go along within your trade and try to do what it takes to make a living. Differentiate yourself from the other fellow if you can, and survive the box stores. Yeah.
You've had an interesting life, and a lot of it was learning on the job and
So?
realizing, like your father and grandfathers, that where there was a problem, there was an opportunity.
Yeah.
And then making the most of it. Your son didn't continue then in the business?
No, Tom. We have Maria, a daughter who is a business lady in Ottawa, and Tom. And Tom liked being in the back end, trucks and stuff. But as someone who is going to take over or become an owner of a business, you're not in the back end, you're in the front end. But Tom, when they did the grade 6 thing in school of the test to see what you might be best at, they came up with him as a jeweler. Well, now, Tom has no indication that he wanted to be a jeweler. But the point is, that's the same thing as being a welder. You have to be very careful, handle that welding rod properly, know how to build that weld. And he is a superb first choice welder working up at Fort McMurray. And when they have the problems, they call for Tom Ford to go over and look after that for them.
An extension of that, Stewart, was your comment about how there was a lack of ability during World War II to keep the machinery going,
Yes.
and you couldn't buy replacements because it wasn't available. Do you want to just elaborate on the role that Stewart Brothers played in that part of the war?
Well, the important thing was the building in Red Deer of at the time, $34,000 brick, massive building. And of course it was on track, because the track went right into Red Deer in what is now a back, well, I think it's a parking lot now, or a back lane. And so they had the unloading dock to get what machines you could get. And then they had the same ability to offload the machine that came in that needed to be repaired. There was a ramp. If it didn't come in on the truck and was dragged in or could be driven in, well, you come up the ramp, bring it into the building, take it down on the lift, take it apart, work on the lathe. We had the lathes, welders, of course. And the thing was, you rebuilt, relathed, did whatever you had to do, and manufactured and repaired the parts necessary. The company also, even during that time and later, was noted for the parts department. We had the parts on hand. You came in, you probably got it and went home. Sidebar to that was, you had daily railway traffic, either from Calgary or Edmonton, from the big international harvester or John Deere or whoever your agency was, to the parts. And they were there on the train next day. So the system worked very well. And during the 50s, when there was the wet years, I think 51, 52 back in there, there was a product in the States called the Hume pickup reel. And the remarkable thing about it was designed with an offset polygon. So when the board on the swather came down with its tines, instead of coming down and just going back up in a circle, it came down and came across the cutter bar, dragging and picking up the fallen grain, because we're talking pancakes, right on the ground, flat, and drawing it into the swather or the combine. My father got the agency. We were agents for Manitoba, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the eastern portion of BC. And my father Graham always said that's what saved the business in the 50s, because we had the product, we had the ability to get them, we trucked them up, to get them through Coots at the border, split them onto 2 trucks because the Alberta load limits were lower. My father mentioned coming home one time with the reels in a little 3/4 ton truck, and the headlights were showing the telephone bars on the lines going down the road. It was going home uphill all the way. But that was another place where the business had the ability to handle that product. And the key to the handling of that product was what was called the adapter, the end, to fit the reel to the swather or combine. Because a 14-foot Massey wasn't a 14-foot Cockshutt, which wasn't a 14-foot International. The 14-foot might be 13'6", it might be 14'3". So the drive end had to be right for the one order. When you've got these products coming in and you don't know whether it's going to be sold to the John Deere guy, the Massey guy, the Harvester guy, the Cockshutt guy, or whoever. Some were pre-ordered when you were bringing it in, and that's fine. You got the factory end on it. So Hume, down in the States, gave us all the drawings for these ends. The Red Deer shop was where they were made, and we had the ability to do it right there. And some of them, I remember going up with my dad and picking one up that had just been welded, and it was so damn hot that he stuck it in a bit of oil to cool it down. Well, we got it to Penfold, and they had to drill for the jerk fitting, for the grease fitting. Didn't have a bit that would go through it because it'd been tempered with oil. And the result was they had to nip into Red Deer and get a better bit to drill to get that thread in. But that's how important, again, that was. And having it meant that we could supply the product but literally save a whole bunch of farmers and give them the ability to get that crop off. There was one, and we have the photographs because Hume came out, Simon Hazar, who's just out on the C&E Trail farm between us and Innisfail. And there's the picture of Simon on his combine, and there's that crop that's as flat as the table. And it just picked it up. And Simon wept. You know, he's going to be okay. He's saved. So the ability to service that particular product, but again, the forethought in having the machine shop in 1935. 20 years later, it's, you know, doing its job.
Necessity.
Yeah.
You're certainly highlighting how agriculturally orientated Red Deer and Central Alberta, or the communities in Central Alberta were before oil came along.
Oh yeah.
In Leduc.
Yeah. Very much so. Yeah. And of course, you know, you had quarter section, two quarter farmers, and you see that disappear, you know.
True.
And I know the fellow who looks after my 60 acres behind here, but bought the farm that when we sold it. I asked him, I said, well, how many acres do you need? Well, he said 4,000 in this area. And he doesn't own them all, but he farms them all. But it takes that. I was in Saskatchewan over on a trip with a nature group. Eileen and I were over there, and we hired a fellow from the wildlife people over there, worked for the government, to take us out on a trip. And we got toured around by him, and then the next day I had a flat tire. So I went into this little town, and there was a tire shop. It was a Sunday, but the owner was there. And I thought, well, fine. I was the guy that got called on Sunday when someone needed something, so I'm not ashamed to go over and see if he'll fix my tire. So I went over to see him, and there a little bit of back and forth just to see if you're legit or not, and then fine, he fixed the tire. So I said, well, in this area of Saskatchewan, just over the border from Alberta, how big are the farms? 30,000 acres. And that's what it takes, because it's dry land. And when you drive through there, you sort of see somebody over there, and then there's just the horizon. Oh, you go, oh, there's one over there. And that's how it is. So it's that much of a change. But we're here, you know, we're parkland farming and stuff. You get down in where my wife's dad was from. He was irrigated land, and you know, you don't need as much on irrigated land because you know you're going to get a crop unless nature interferes with snow or hail, and it's a different story. And plus, they can grow crops that have more value. You know, you always have a beet contract or something like that. But no, it was, we were agriculturally bound. On the building materials side, of course, you always had your contractor, and the big one that you question whether you made money on, but he gave you volume and made sure your inventory turned. But we dealt with the smaller ones and the big ones. Yeah.
Stewart, one of the Stewart legacies in Red Deer is called the Stewart Room, and despite renovations and improvements and enlargements, it's still there.
Yeah, still that room,
and,
yes.
Perhaps you'd tell us a bit about how that came about,
that
what material the family have left with the museum.
That was a bit interesting. Norman and Tom had both died by the time that the museum was going to get built. So by then, a number of the other partners were no longer partners, but there was 10 in the original partnership. So we approached them, and by we I mean my mother and father and myself, and said, would you like to be part of this? So everybody said, sure. So we said, well, $1,000 a piece, there's 10 of us. So we, I think my father did the negotiating. He went in and said, no, we'd like to make a donation, and but we would like to be recognized. So at this time, nobody knew what was expected. And I'm talking about nobody in the donation area. Businesses or individuals that, had money and could be put upon to support a certain thing. And so Graham said, well, $10,000, but we'd like to be recognized. Well, there was a hustle. Well, we've got a room. Okay, fine. We'll call it the Stewart room. Fine, $10,000. And it wasn't one of these ones like now, the EPCOR Center, where you get EPCOR for 5 years. And then it's the somebody else center. No, this is there. It's carved in the wall. So what we were told afterwards, and Morris was the one, of course, who was very involved then.
It's Morris Llewellyn.
Yes. Morris said that was the one that set the standard and established what was expected. And after that, the money flowed in and there was no problem at all. But it's just that I had a similar thing with the Western Retail Lumbermen Association too. It was a whole bunch of lumber yards, but they were the big yards were the Monarch, Beaver, Crown,
Motard,
Revelstoke, and these were big yards. So they just had a guy that would go to the meeting. He was a vice president. It was a title, but not much else. So you get discussing things that we were wanting to do, and we wanted to do a history. So, well, how are we going to support it? How are we going to? So, apparently I'm the only guy there that can, that writes the checks at home and can write the check. So I said, well, let's just get it going. I said, I'll guarantee you $10,000. Okay, fine, we'll get it going. I never wrote the check. It all went through, the money was there, everything happened, and we had our 1990 100th anniversary of the Western Retail Lumbermen Association. But it was the same sort of thing that you just have to have that trigger.
It's a combination of an idea.
Yeah.
And
why would I be doing that? I mean, they were the multi-million-dollar companies. they couldn't sign the check.
Sometimes it becomes a point of, if I don't, it's maybe embarrassing.
Yeah.
I can't go home and tell this story. Somebody from Penhold making a donation before we did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But as I say, I never had to write the check, but it was just that you have to trigger, trigger something. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, nice story and background information on that that I wasn't aware of. You have over your lifetime developed some interesting avocational interests and hobbies, Stewart. I can remember way back when you telling me about some of your experiences before you joined the family company. I think, did they involve the UN, was it, or?
Oh yeah,
and they've certainly carried on. When I look at the patriotic flag
yes.
in front.
That's back when I was in school, and I think it was the Oddfellows. It was the Oddfellows Hall, but maybe it wasn't the Oddfellows. But there was a contest about getting a trip to the UN, so you had to do a speech and a written. I won on the speech, but I failed on the written, and somebody else got the trip.
But then wouldn't be Heather Wood, would it?
Yeah. But then I was in the Air Cadets, and they had in Alberta, 2 cadets would get a trip either to the United States to visit a state with the Civil Air Patrol down there, or, and of course this is NATO times and CETO and all this sort of stuff. And the other one was a trip to Great Britain. Well, of course, the trip to Great Britain was a key one, but I only had one camp. We went out to Abbotsford to the camp. So I only had one camp. And I said, well, I'd like to go to Britain because that's where the family's from, and my grandfather Ford came out of Wales in 1910, and et cetera, et cetera. I had a very short interview, but I didn't get that. I got the one to the States. So you got a train pass and meal tickets, and we went by train all the way down through Ottawa to Montreal, and were met there, and then we flew to Washington. Had a marvelous time there for about a week. Then we flew to Arkansas, spent a week in Arkansas, went to the Petit Jean Ranch that Rockefeller had spent $5 million on and was raiding Santa Gertrudis cattle. It was set up so that they could take the stalls out and have a dance floor for 200 people. They had 2 artificial lakes, 27 and 25 million gallon capacity each, with a motorboat on them so they could ski, but they pumped the water up from the river 700 feet below. I mean, you know, this is Rockefeller wealth. And he was getting a little teed off because he'd like it to start making money. And then we flew back to New York and spent a week there. And in each of these cases, we were with the total groups because it was NATO. So the Brits were there, the French were there, anyone in NATO, and then the South American fellows. And the South American fellows were all actually in the forces. They were older than we were. But the Brits bunch, we got along well with them. And so we had a tour of the UN, and that was wonderful. And then about, well, that's the 50s, about 15 years later, the UN had a big meeting and all the heads of state were there. So I said, I'm going to go there. So I did. And I stayed in the same hotel that we had stayed in with the Air Cadets. And I went into the Canadian legation and got a ticket, went in. So then the next day, I couldn't get a ticket. So I thought, well, I got a passport and it says a Canadian citizen is a British subject. Great. I'm going to go over to the Brits. So I went to the Brits and the guy said, oh yeah, I'm sorry, but the lady that does that has just left. Come in back over tomorrow. So I went back over tomorrow and they had a ticket for me. And I felt a little guilty because there was 2 Brits there, same age as I was, that wanted to go. They had a flight out in the afternoon back to Britain. And I don't know if they got a ticket or not, but I got a ticket from the Brits. So I was over and I was, that's the cleaning lady. So I went over and got through the security, got in, and I was put down on the main floor. And that was fine. But then all of a sudden, in come a whole bunch of guys in uniform, nice khaki uniforms. So they had to be sitting there. So we got shuffled off. So I'm sitting over here in the press gallery now. Nikita Khrushchev is right over there, about 30 feet from me. And the guy that caused all the furor was Sukarno from the Philippines. Comes in with this guy in a chocolate-colored uniform, briefcase. He hands him his speech. He does his thing, hands it back, hands him the next page. all this show, and it's just this guy that, you know, sitting over there without a nuclear bomb, like the guy over here, this guy. So anyway, that was kind of interesting. But I was behind Khrushchev when he took his fists, and he was going like this with his fists. And I can see by his jowls that he's laughing. So I watched it on the thing on TV that night. Sure enough, he's having a ball. The next day I got over, I was put up in the first balcony. And I noticed that there's people behind me are dressed in suits, but they're kind of not very good suits, baggy suits. You know, not really good tailoring. Well, that's fine. So I'm sitting in the front row, and I've got my binoculars, and the security comes through and checks the binoculars. Okay, fine, you can use your binoculars. And Macmillan is speaking, and that's when he did the speech where he said that he thought the Russians were starting to believe their own propaganda. But Khrushchev also spoke that day, and he came up, and he was speaking, and all of a sudden, bang, everything gets shut off. The president of the assembly was the president of Ireland at that time. He's going like this with his gavel. The gavel breaks and goes behind him. So Khrushchev's standing there, what's that? So this little guy comes running up, and the translation things were a plastic thing went over your ear like this, hooks it up over Khrushchev's ear, and the president just says that he had made it very plain that the beginning, because of the number of heads of state, no remarks would be made by one head of state against another. So Khrushchev gets the translation, and he says, well, the Americans were beefing up on Red China, but not as a head of state, as a country. So everybody got settled down again, and things continued. It just happens that there's a thing on the internet site, Quora. I happened to be watching it last night, and there is this thing about the President of Ireland and Khrushchev and the whack and breaking of the
The mouth.
and I just thought, I know about that, I was there. But again, Khrushchev makes a point, and they clap behind me. That's just like having a lion's breath on your back. And there's people that believe this guy, but it was the weirdest thing to be sitting, you know, in the United States, in the UN, and someone claps for Khrushchev behind you. It was quite unsettling. But it's just the wonderful things you pick up in your life if you have certain interests.